Good afternoon. This is Marc Petock from Lynxspring. Welcome to 30 Minutes with Lynxspring, our monthly webinar series. Cybersecurity can no longer be thought of as a nice-to-have in today's world. The operational, financial, and reputational impact to a business is tremendous. Security must be considered a fundamental requirement for any building operational infrastructure and all the systems that make it up. Cybersecurity continues to be one of the utmost important pieces that affect every stakeholder within a building environment, whether you're a system integrator, a contractor, a building owner, a building operator, a facility manager, or whoever. So this session today, I am pleased to have joining with me Lynxspring's Director of Engineering, Chris Ryan, and Darik Metge from our technical support group. Darik happens to be one of our, what I call, young gun aces when it comes to technical support. And what we thought we would do today is talk a little bit about enhancing Niagara AX and Niagara 4 with respect to cybersecurity. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chris and Darik. And one quick thing, we are recording, and so we will make this available. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the question box within the platform that we're using for the webinar. And again, thank you everyone for joining, and I'm going to turn it over to Darik.
Thank you, Mark. Well, no pressure there, him calling me an ace. I do appreciate that, Mark. As some of you do know, my name is Darik Metge, and I am part of the support department here at Lynxspring. I've been with the company for a couple of years now, and during that time I have talked with a lot of people about cybersecurity and specifically how to set up secure connections within Niagara. A lot of the folks that I talk to tend to get a little bit confused about the concepts of cybersecurity generally, which makes integrating a BAS system into an existing secure network somewhat intimidating. So this is pretty understandable. Cybersecurity is a pretty confusing and complex field, and the methods that are used to secure a network are difficult to establish and maintain. Yet we all know the importance of having a secure network. We even want this for our own systems, and our customers are demanding it in practically every setting. Nobody wants their data, their devices, or their systems compromised, and we've all been inundated with explanations and statistics and rationales to why we should protect these things. So we need to face the facts, and that is that secure networks are here to stay, and they are likely going to even become more complex as technology and software, even in our own industry, become more advanced. Now, before I go, well, actually, there's a few questions that tend to come up, especially from those of us who don't spend our time building out TCP/IP networks. How do we maintain the integrity of our customers' existing infrastructure when we're hired to integrate our own systems into theirs? How do we secure our own Niagara systems? What tools are available in Niagara to meet the needs of our customers and make sure we meet their security requirements? Unfortunately, we only have limited time today, and there's a lot more information than what I can cover in 30 minutes. So my goal right now is just to try to answer some of these questions by focusing on a couple of specific concepts that are associated with the components in Niagara. These topics are proven or have proven themselves to be pretty difficult to understand when trying to integrate a Niagara application into a secure network. Now, something that I'll note here is that a lot of this information that I'm going to go over is contained in the Niagara SSL document that is in the docs directory of a given ProBuilder installation. So if you haven't seen this directory before, I encourage you to take a look. There's a wealth of information here. It's a valuable resource for deploying and maintaining a Niagara network from start to finish, including the security concepts that we'll be discussing today. So to get things started, I am going to define some of the terms and concepts that are commonly used when you're creating SSL connections between Niagara applications. So Niagara offers two pretty well established protocols for securing data transmission across networks. These include the SSL and TLS protocols. SSL basically stands for Secure Sockets Layer, and it was developed by Netscape back in the 1990s, mainly for the purpose of transmitting documents over the internet privately. Both SSL and TLS, use similar protocols, designed to ensure the privacy and integrity of data being communicated over the network. TLS is actually derived from SSL, and that's what you're probably going to see in the more recent builds of Niagara and ProBuilder. So the protocols that SSL and TLS use employ what is a concept known as a public key infrastructure, or PKI, which is basically a set of procedures used to maintain trust across a network. A public key is essentially a long random number that's derived mathematically from a recipient's private key that's used to encrypt messages that are sent out from that recipient. These public keys are made available through certificate authorities out on the internet, and they are made available to the public through a repository that they offer. The private key component of the PKI system is intended to be just what its name represents, private, and so only the recipient of these messages know the private key, which is used to decrypt the information that is coming in from the senders. So even though the public key is derived from the private key, they say it's virtually impossible to determine what the private key is just by having the public key, which is why the PKI system is the generally accepted model for securing networks. So this is a little bit confusing of a concept, so I'm going to explain how it works a little bit more. PKI technology is designed to permit two or more parties that have no existing relationship to trust each other for the purposes of exchanging sensitive data. This is accomplished through a third party, which is mutually trusted by all the users on the system who essentially vouch for each other's identity. In the PKI system, the initial exchange of information and the examination of the keys and certificates is known as a handshake. And then once that handshake is completed, trust is established between the two devices, and the encryption rules that are going to be used during the connection are set. Since the private and public keys are mathematically related, though, whatever is encrypted with the public key may only be decrypted by the corresponding private key that was used to create it. If you don't have the private key that matches the public key attached to the incoming message, then you cannot decrypt the data that you're getting. This is what maintains the security of the connection. Now, within ProBuilder, for example, when you connect a platform, a connection to the platform or station using SSL, that first login request that your ProBuilder is making will encrypt the data and send it out using that public key that was previously established for the device that you're connecting to, such as a JENE. Since the recipient station is the only device that has access to its own private key, it is the only entity that's capable of decrypting the data back into its original form. Therefore, it's the only device that can read the data that's coming in from your ProBuilder. So assuming that the proper key exchanges happen and the appropriate digital certificates are installed on each device, the connection is made and uninterrupted communications between the devices can occur. The beauty of all this is that outside parties who may have gotten access to that network still can't decrypt that information that's passing between the two devices because they don't have the private key, so the information stays confidential. So the second major component to these SSL connections is to establish secure communication and to essentially verify the identity of all the devices at each end of a connection. Trusting that the data being sent is actually reaching the intended device, whether it's encrypted or not, and that it's not being hijacked by a third party is critical. Certificate authorities and the digital certificates that they provide take care of this aspect of the data transmission by assuring that the sending party knows or trusts that the receiving party is the true entity and not an imposter. Digital certificates are attachments to an electronic message that verifies the user sending the message is who they claim to be. It's also used to provide the receiver with the means to encrypt a reply back to the sender. So digital certificates essentially just certify the ownership of the public key that's included within the certificate. So anyone who wants to send encrypted messages or establish these encrypted communications between devices needs to apply for a digital certificate from a certificate authority. And as I alluded to, a certificate authority is basically the party that issues these digital certificates that contains the public key that's used by the sending devices, as well as the information that identifies who that applicant is. These third-party commercial certificate authorities usually charge a fee for their services. You may be familiar with some of these, for example, GeoTrust, VeriSign, DigiCert, Symantec, to name a few. Now, Niagara does provide the ability for you to be your own certificate authority and create self-signed certificates, which can be used within your applications. These would be similar to the self-signed certificate that you get from Tridium with your ProBuilder and Niagara installations. Most of the well-known certificate authorities, though, that are out there will not sign certificates that they did not create themselves, but having the ability to create your own does allow you to generate a unique certificate that's different from the standard Tridium certificate that everyone has, which provides a little more security without having to pay for the service that a commercial authority is going to charge. Understand, though, that self-signed certificates are typically only recommended for networks that are going to be isolated from the internet, since these networks are less susceptible to malicious attacks from the outside. If you know your Niagara system is going to be exposed to the internet, however, we do not recommend using self-signed certificates, but instead suggest obtaining a commercial root certificate from one of the known authorities for the added security that they provide. Again, our time is short today, so I'm unfortunately not going to be able to. I'm not going to be discussing how to create your own self-signed root certificates. For the purpose of this example, we're going to assume that we already have a root certificate. So if you're still interested in that information, though, I believe it's under Chapter 3 of the Niagara SSL document that I referred to earlier. There we go. So this window here probably looks familiar to many of you. It is the standard Tridium self-signed certificate, which is made available to everyone so that they can at least have a basic SSL connection between Niagara devices. If you plan to incorporate SSL security into your system, this certificate can be used to get things off the ground until you have generated your own or have obtained one from a certificate authority commercially. Creating your own certificate will ensure that you have a certificate that is unique to your application, or if you purchase one from a commercial certificate authority, you know that it's been properly approved and verified by a well-known and reputable source. Here's another window that's probably familiar to those of you who have worked with the certificates in Niagara before. This is the certificate management interface that can be accessed through the platform of a given instance of Niagara. Now, it's important to note that to establish an SSL connection between two stations, you must apply the correct certificates at each end of the connection in both stations. Granted, you may have applications where you only need one-sided connections. For example, if a supervisor is connecting down to a remote JENE to pull its points with no need for the JENE to connect back up to the supervisor. However, if you know that both devices need to send and receive information to each other, then you have to make sure that you install the root certificate in the appropriate place on each device. If you don't, then the connection will fail at one end or the other, or it could fail at both. So what we see here in this particular screenshot is the key store that contains the digital certificates that are contained on the device that it uses to establish its end of the connection. They call it a key store because the digital certificate that's listed actually contains the public key inside of it, along with the certificate applicant's identification information. So the only real difference between Niagara 4 and AX when it comes to the SSL connections and the certificate management tool is that Niagara 4 contains two different trust store tabs. I show them both here. The single trust store tab that you see in the AX at the top there is going to contain the same information that's in the system trust store in the Niagara 4 version down below. And essentially that is the recognized, trusted certificate authorities that the Java runtime engine is aware of for the given platform. The user trust store that is available in Niagara 4 is where you would import the keys, or rather the certificates that you create yourself. So this particular slide, which is the third tab in AX, fourth tab in Niagara 4, is the allowed hosts list, which is essentially the security exceptions for any hosts that have attempted a connection with a particular device, and the server certificate and the public key that was used during that handshake process didn't match the private key that was installed. In other words, if the private key that resides in the trust store of the receiving device does not match the public key that's used to encrypt the message, or if that root certificate is missing completely from the receiving device, the host that is sending the message is going to be added to this list. And until that exception from the list is approved, the connection from that same host is going to be denied every time, and the connection is going to fail. So any hosts that send an unmatched server certificate will be listed here in the Allowed Hosts tab. I should probably differentiate between the three different certificate management tool options that you're going to find when you're working in ProBuilder. First, you have the ProBuilder application itself, which is accessed through the Tools option at the top toolbar of ProBuilder. This certificate manager is associated with making secure connections from your instance of ProBuilder down to another station, whether that's a Supervisor or it is to a JENE. Next is the Supervisor certificate management tool that's actually accessed through the platform that's running on the local host. And we have the same interface here on a JENE. You just got to make sure that you're actually in the correct certificate management tool when it comes to the various certificates that you're working with. So the Supervisor and the JENE are accessed the exact same way under the platform. And so this here is what you see in the JENE. So AX and N4 are mostly the same when it comes to setting up SSL connections. The concepts that I've described so far apply in both versions, and except for the different color scheme that you find in Niagara 4, the processes for creating, signing, and installing certificates, as well as the location of these components, are the same. So next I'm going to walk you through how to change the platform, the web service, and the Fox service to allow SSL connections, as well as how to submit a certificate signing request to a certificate authority. Let me rephrase that. How to request a certificate signing request from a certificate authority. So our example assumes that we already have a root certificate from a commercial authority, or you have generated one yourself. And then finally, I'll explain how to install a signed certificate in the trust store of each device. So most of you have probably done this before, or at least seen this option. This is where you would go to change the TLS SSL settings in a given platform. This happens to be on the local host for a Supervisor. You simply go to the platform administration tool and the change TLS settings to pull up the the options for selecting your protocol that's going to be used and setting it to use TLS, and then ultimately to change which certificate you're going to use for the SSL connection. This is the same thing, but from the perspective of the JENE. Again, same location, same menu. You just access the platform administration under the platform of the JENE TLS settings, and then you have the same options to manipulate there. The same is true for the web service. This happens to be a shot from Niagara 4 web service. The configurations are at the same location in both AX and Niagara 4, and you'll notice the similar components that you would change there, where you can enable SSL, force it to use HTTPS only, and then again choose the certificate that you're going to use. In this case, you see that the Tridium certificate that comes standard is what's selected at the moment. We'll be changing that a little bit later. So with the introduction of Niagara 4, the FOX service has actually been moved out of the Niagara network property sheet and has been moved to the services component of the station itself. So it's a little bit easier to find, and that's what we see here. To change the FOX service, similar menu, but you just have to access it through the services under the config component of your Supervisor, and then also in your JENE. And then this is the view that you're probably familiar with also in AX. The same components to manipulate, only they are found under the property sheet of the Niagara network, where you change them there. So now that we have our platform, our FOX service, and our web service enabled for SSL on all of our devices, I'm going to discuss how to manage the server certificates that need to be installed on the various devices in our system. This is where I find that most people get hung up with the configuration, so I'm going to do my best to describe this as clearly as possible, but it is kind of confusing, so don't be alarmed if there's questions after this. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to assume that we've already obtained or created our own root certificate. So the next question is, what do we do with it once we have it? In this scenario, we will use the same root certificate to sign all of the server certificates that are going to be used during all of these connections. Remember, the root certificate contains the private key that was used to generate the public key that the various devices need to encrypt the data that they're going to be sending out. So for my example, and what you're going to see coming up, my example uses one Supervisor, one JENE, and one instance of ProBuilder. And the Supervisor and the JENE both need to communicate with each other over the FOX network, and I'm going to connect to the JENE directly with my ProBuilder. So I want all of these connections to be secure over the internet or over the network. So each entity must have the appropriate certificate installed. Don't forget, again, this information is explained in detail in that Niagara SSL document, so I encourage you to take a look there if you have any questions after this presentation. So if you acted as your own certificate authority and generated a root certificate, then that certificate is going to appear in the key store, and it's going to have a yellow icon to the left of it. In this case, you need to export that root certificate to a place on your computer where it can be accessible later during the certificate signing process. It is important that you keep these root certificates in a place where they're protected. This is the core protection in this whole system, is keeping that root certificates private, because if you have the root certificate, then you have the means to decrypt messages that are coming in using that public key that was derived from it. So if you're creating your own root certificates, be sure that you use a strong password when you're prompted to, because that is essentially the last means of protection if somebody else happens to get a hold of that root certificate. So again, like I said, you need to export that root certificate out of the key store and place it in that separate folder for access later. Now, something that is pretty important in this scenario is these root certificates, and the ones that you get from certificate authorities are going to have the .pem file extension. So just make sure you're looking at that whenever you create these certificates or you receive them from your authority, because that will tell you that it is a root certificate. Next, we need to create the server certificates for each JENE and the Supervisor and our ProBuilder that's going to be communicating across this network. This is done using the New button. When you click New, you're going to get this window, and you basically fill out the information, noting the fields that are in it. And just remember, these server certificates are what contain the public key that it's going to use when it sends its data out. I should also mention that there are actually multiple ways that you can create a server certificate on a JENE. In our example, we're actually assuming that we are able to connect to it directly and go through the platform certificate management tool. You can also access a JENE, the certificate management tool, through the platform services of a given station running on a JENE. So if you are not at the site, you can still accomplish this remotely. So once you have completed this information, you click OK, and you will be prompted with this window. Correction. You will actually, I'll look back here. Yes. Okay, so after you create that, you are now going to see that certificate. I was right. This window here shows the key store and the new certificate that we just installed. So we now need to have all of those certificates signed. So we do this through the certificate signing request and create separate files using that cert request button at the bottom. So when you press that cert request button, you'll be prompted to review the certificate, and when you click OK, it is going to generate a save window that you need to navigate then to the location. Again, that if you created a folder on your computer separate, navigate to that folder where you can save this file, because you're going to need it again during the certificate signing process that'll come in later. So we just need to repeat this certificate signing request process 3 times and save each CSR file to our designated folder. Remember, we're doing this for ProBuilder, for our Supervisor, and for our JENE. And in this window here, you see highlighted each certificate that was created in each of their corresponding key stores. So each CSR file that was created must now be signed by the private key of the root certificate that was created before, or that you had obtained from that third-party certificate authority. So to do this, you need to access the certificate signing tool, which is again found in the tools menu bar, the toolbar at the top of your ProBuilder. Just click on, when you activate it, click on the browse icon at the right, and then locate and open the CSR file for the server certificate that you wish to have signed. This is actually the validation process of that public certificate that we talked about earlier. So when you select that file, just confirm that you have the correct certificate for the specific device that you're signing. Select the valid dates that you want to apply to that certificate. This is essentially the start date and the expiration date that you want that certificate to, that you want to apply to that certificate. And choose the root certificate that you want to use to sign or validate the server certificate. Now, I'll go ahead and note here that if you have obtained or generated multiple root certificates and put them in the same folder, you'll have multiple root certificates available in that drop-down. So you want to be sure that you have selected the correct root certificate to sign this specific server certificate. And that's going to be important when you go to install these and import them into the respective devices. So just enter the password for the root certificate that was created, and then just repeat this procedure, In our case, we're going to repeat it 3 times for each device that's going to be communicating securely. So since the JENE platform and station both share the same key and trust stores, you can actually use either the station platform services or the platform itself to do this work. Again, we are assuming that we're connecting directly to the JENE, so we're going to use the platform certificate management tool. Now that we have created our signed certificates, we need to import those certificates and essentially convert the unsigned server certificates that are currently sitting on each of those devices into a signed certificate. So to do this, you access the certificate management tool of the specific device and then click the import button and then navigate to that .pem file that was created when you signed the certificate and click open. And then just confirm that the certificate that comes up is the one that you intended, and click the import button. And when you do that, you should see the little yellow icon to the left of your certificate turn to green, which indicates that it's changed from an unsigned certificate to a signed certificate. And then just repeat this process for each device and make sure that that shield turns green, and you should be good to go. So once again, we just then need to go back to each of our settings for the platform and for the station and for our web service and our Fox service, and make sure that they are set to the new certificate that now resides on each of those components. You're going to be prompted with this window again, and you just need to select the proper certificate. Right now it probably says Tridium because that's the default. Just select your certificate and repeat that for each of the services. And then the next step is to import that original root certificate that was used to sign the server certificates into the trust store for each of the devices, so that when future handshakes are made from these devices, the root certificate will be able to validate the server certificate that's coming in and be able to decrypt the data. So to do this, you essentially just need to access the trust stores in each of the certificate management tools for the JENE, the Supervisor, and your ProBuilder, and click the import button and navigate to the server, rather the root certificate that was used to sign all of these certificates back in the certificate signing process. It is possible that your station-to-station connection between the Supervisor and the JENE might fail, like mine did in my little example here. That's because my host names didn't match when I was signing the certificates. So as a result, I had an entry in my allowed hosts and in both my JENE and my Supervisor. So to resolve that, you simply select the entry that's in there and click approve at each end of the device, and then just confirm that your stations can connect to to each other once that's finished. So that is actually all the information that I had today. I know I packed a lot in for 30 minutes, so I'm going to turn it back over to Mark, and if you guys have any questions, happy to answer them.
Right. Well, we got some good questions. First of all, thanks, Darik. We greatly appreciate it. And again, just to remind everybody, Darik did cover a lot of information. You'll be receiving an email from us in a couple of days where you can find the information and things like that. And just if you want, if you drop an email to marketing@lynxspring.com and you want a copy of the PowerPoint itself, we'll be more than happy to send that out to you. So a question that's come in, there is a hard-coded SSL certificate in Niagara that everyone has. The Tridium self-signed certificate and corresponding keypad generated during installation, not standard or the same for everyone. The name is simply the same.
Yeah, so yeah, it's basically everyone in their installation has a Tridium self-signed certificate. When Niagara is installed, it creates a certificate, as you saw in Darik's slides, that says Tridium. But those certificates are unique to the installation. They're not identical across each one. So the thing to be of note there is that each of those certificates that are called Tridium are not the same. This is why if you want to secure your system, you have to go through, as Darik showed, create a certificate on the Supervisor, create a certificate on the JENE, and even create a certificate in your ProBuilder so that you can sign those and have connect all those dots and have those all signed and valid at the same time. That's really the only question comment that we have, and I know we're a little bit over time here.
Yeah, so I just want to go ahead again, thank everybody for joining us. Our next 30 minutes with Lynxspring is scheduled for Wednesday, October 19th. Stay tuned for the subject matter, and based on that too, if from our audience out there, if there's any subject matters that you would like us to cover and think about in future 30 minutes with Lynxspring, drop us an email at marketing@lynxspring.com. Again, thanks to everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next month.